Hello everyone, and welcome to Shedding of the Ego. Today I want to discuss a video, or make a response to a video by Gavin McInnes of Rebel Media. And this video specifically deals with the problem that we have in our legal system with underage boys being taken advantage of by older women, older female teachers in positions of authority over these boys. And the traditionalist mindset that seems to think that, it's okay to excuse this kind of behavior. So this is what we're going to explore today, gentlemen. This is going to be a response to his video, and let's see if we can't get into some things here. Now, the video starts with Gavin talking about this documentary in which poor black men in the inner cities opened up a fighting league in which, instead of resorting to irreversible gun violence, these men get together and made a competitive fighting league in order to A, solve their respective beefs in a non-lethal way, and B, make some money in the process. And he celebrates this as, an entrepreneurial effort, and actually is against local government for trying to shut it down, citing that hosting these fights is a felony, and of course the possibility of the fighters dying in these fights would also result in multiple felonies for the people that were hosting them. Now, I do happen to agree that these people should be allowed to fight. The risk of dying is going to be present in, the UFC, or in, the heavyweight champion of the world boxing match, as well as in these street fights you see here. The fighters, from what I've gathered, do have some basic rule sets, such as, no striking to the back of the head, etc., that would indicate that they are, in fact, cognizant of some of the precautions that have to be taken. And I think that if they meet these requirements, that they should be allowed to fight, and this business should be allowed to flourish and grow, and, capitalism and whatnot. So, with that said, McInnes uses this as a way of setting up a set of arguments and conflations that eventually sheds light on the mentality of these people like McInnes, people that I refer to as, traditionalists, people that, in my opinion, are very gynocentric individuals. Now, we're going to play the relevant bits and pieces here, and we're going to see if we can't address some of these arguments. So, I'm going to kind of start midway through the argument he's presenting about the inner city fighters, because it's not really relevant to the video here. But of course, I'm going to provide the link for anybody that wants to watch the video in full.
Violence and saying, let's stop settling stuff with guns, let's settle it in the ring and make money doing it. Great idea, great entrepreneurial spirit. Unfortunately, the authorities, who were white, decided that this is too dangerous because they could die. And the law states that hosting backyard fights is a felony. And also, if someone dies in the ring, then the fighter who killed him is responsible, and the guy who organized the fight is responsible. Now, I understand this law. This law is made for middle-class white kids going, oh, put your dukes up, Roger, you slimy gent. Oh, there's no physicians around. But in a world where people are dying every day, it's okay to start a new business where less people are dying. And in the course of the documentary, one of the fighters does die, but he doesn't die in the ring, he gets shot in the back of the head. What you have to understand about laws in a culture is black people are different than white people. Poor people are different than rich people. Equality is a myth. Yes, laws should be the same across the board, but we have judges, and we have to somehow figure out a way to adapt to different environments.
Okay, so again, a reasonable argument is made here. I can't say that I completely disagree with everything that McInnes is saying, but I will say that the law is, in my opinion, designed to be as impartial as possible, and it is designed to be as impartial as possible with good reason. Because when we start to treat individuals based on this or that inherent characteristic differently under the law, problems will inevitably arise, injustices will inevitably happen. As with everything, there is nuance and sometimes exceptions are made, but I believe that we should strive to minimize those exceptions whenever possible. I will not say exactly where those exceptions do or don't belong, other than to say that the potential for those exceptions to do harm to the people they accept should be correlated to the likelihood that the exception should be done away with.
Now, this reminds me of a guy I've had on my old free speech podcast named Galen Boffman. He is a gay gentleman who's quite old now. By old, I mean younger than me. But when he was 19, a 14-year-old gay solicited him, basically stalked him, and all but begged to perform fellatio upon the gentleman. I'm trying to phrase this in the cleanest way possible. This is not how I talk in a bar. And my people, males, are not great at refusing those things. If we were driving a school bus and a mom came over and suggested it with all the kids screaming and we were headed towards a cliff, it would take some elbowing to say no. Anyway, he didn't say no. He broke down and was charged as a sex offender. That was considered pedophilia. These laws that were made for retaining a young girl's chastity are now being applied to young gay teens. He barely escaped a life sentence, and he ended up with 9 years in prison. Now, he kept appealing the sentence, and the problem with that is when you are going to trial, you have to go to solitary because they don't want bruises on your face. So he spent about half his sentence in solitary, 4.5 years in solitary confinement for fellatio from a gay teen to a gay teen. No chastity was violated. This gay teen went on to have an incredibly elaborate sex life, but he was racked with guilt, and I would say suicidal, over what he had done to his crush, his high school crush. Gays are different than straights.
Now, here's where the problems arise. McInnes is saying here that this gay 14-year-old boy at the time offered oral sex to this man who buckled under the temptation and had to then, as a result of that, register as a sex offender. Now, McInnes says that these laws, these statutory rape laws that this man was convicted under, were, quote, designed for retaining the chastity of young girls, end quote. And it is then implied that young gay men interested in sexual experimentation need not be bogged down by these chastity laws. But for some reason he assumes that young heterosexual women should. It's almost as if he has assumed that 14-year-old girls aren't capable of finding themselves in the exact same situation as this 14-year-old gay boy was in. What exactly is different about a 14-year-old boy being racked with guilt about having been involved with the incarceration of his of-age lover, and a 14-year-old girl who willingly consented being racked with guilt because her of-age, 19-year-old male lover was incarcerated after their consensual sex acts? Where's the difference? Because I'm not seeing it. We are biologically designed to have sex, men and women. And if we're going to have laws suggesting that it is predatory for a 19-year-old to have sex with a 14-year-old, then it should, in fact, apply across the board. This is one of those situations where, yes, it should be, regardless of gender. If we're going to prosecute people for sleeping with underage, teenagers, then it needs to apply no matter who's doing it.
Which brings us to a recent ruling on a teacher in Florida. Jennifer Fitcher just got 22 years for raping 3 high school boys that were 17. The mother in the case talked about how she could see her son losing her son. He was changing before her very eyes. And it reminds me of, all these other cases where we talk about the horrific violation of innocence that happens with young girls. And then they just flip it over to boys. And you go, I remember being 17. We were so obsessed with tits. It was like being haunted by a tit ghost. It was always just, I remember praying to God saying, please make me think about sex less. Please, I want to have a normal life. And this woman gets 22 years for that? Now, she should have been fired. And I got it. If I was her dad, dad of one of these boys, I don't know. I might be mad. I feel like I would want to high five the other dads. I'm sorry for having that feeling, but if it was young girls, I would want to murder the teacher with my bare hands. But when I think of the roles reversed, I don't feel this. I feel more of a this shape. And the same with Galen Boffman. I wouldn't be dancing in the streets if my gay son was with a 19-year-old. I'd want to beat the guy up, maybe hospitalize him. And I've said this to Galen, and he sort of goes, well, beats 9 years. What was her name? Carla Homolka? Yeah. She got 12 years for murdering her sister Tammy with her boyfriend, torturing her and raping her, murdering her. That's 12 years, yet a crazy woman fulfilling young teenage boys' fantasies gets 22 years. Again, the myth of equality is creating this crazy world where 17-year-old boys are victims of hot young teachers. Men are different than women, okay? Laws should be the same, I understand that, but let's have some reality checks here, because when we enforce this myth of equality, we inevitably end up hurting the people we purport to help.
Okay, so, I never really did understand the traditionalist mentality. Now, these people mock feminists for thinking that the world owes them something simply for being female, and then, in their own actions, go about showing females that they are owed a pussy pass when they engage in sexual behavior that, by their own admission and by Gavin's own admission, would result in violence if the reverse case of a man sleeping with a 17-year-old girl took place. It's a classic case of how men uphold and perpetuate female hypoagency by reinforcing the fact that women should not be held responsible for the sexual decisions they make. McInnes clearly states that he would want to high-five and celebrate the younger boy, older woman scenario, but would want to violently assault and choke the younger girl, older man scenario. And this again is why I argue that equal treatment under the law is so important, because it can be used as a tool to objectively weed out evolutionary bias, or at least sometimes it can. The attitude that McInnes displays here is precisely why there is such a stark gender sentencing gap, because men and women like him, who happen to be in positions of legal authority, deem it appropriate to legislate their evolutionary bias into legal decisions. These people sling around buzzwords and smears such as identity politics, right? But they're nowhere to be found when boys are getting put in jail for sleeping with consenting teenage girls that are only a year or two younger than them, or when predatory middle-aged women get themselves impregnated by their own students and then collect child support from them afterwards. Now, if you want to see identity politics, folks, then this is it. Now, he does seem for a moment to apply a thin veneer of objectivity to all of this when he states that he would want to hospitalize a gay man for sleeping with his young teenage son, but I wonder if he would also want to hospitalize a lesbian woman for sleeping with his teenage daughter. I would suspect that at this point, the moral code of never hitting a woman would trump any conflicting feelings he had about it, and the woman would be under no threat of violence from him. And of course, the opposite scenario, the other side of this scenario, never is brought up by these people. Now, I'm assuming a lot of these traditionalists have sons, teenage sons. Now, how would these people feel? And notice that they never bring this up, but how would these people feel if some other man, a father of a teenage daughter who voluntarily and consensually slept with his son, choked out his son and, hit him or abused him or even killed him because he slept with some willing, 16, 17-year-old girl, but the father has decided that he has somehow violated her chastity? Okay, and here is where the fundamental misunderstanding makes itself apparent. The fact that he proffers up Karla Homolka as a comparative example here highlights that McInnes does not understand why people like Karla Homolka, a violent rapist and serial killer, is now currently walking free, married, and in custody of her child, which she had after she helped murder her teenage sister. The reason Karla Homolka is walking free today is precisely because we do not treat men and women equally under the law. It is precisely due to the types of mentality that Gavin is expressing here. The idea that because women are different than men, and they are, that this somehow means that they should have a different standard applied to them. And despite him saying multiple times that yes, we should have equal treatment under the law, he in the same breath argues that we should treat this teacher, who was in a position of authority over these teenage boys, differently because she was a woman and they were teenage boys and they must have wanted it anyway. As though the experiences of all teenage boys regarding sex are the same exact as Gavin's, which according to this video are sex obsessed. He seems to believe that it then follows that no teenage boys could ever possibly feel victimized by the older female teacher or older women who manipulate them into having sex with them. There are, of course, real-life ramifications to these instances. These boys are sometimes expected to pay child support to these women who had no business sleeping with them in the first place, and again, the reverse does not apply. We do not expect 17-year-old girls who are impregnated by 22-year-old male teachers to pay the male child support. No, we put them in jail, or worse yet, traditionalists like Gavin McInnes feel justified in carrying out violence against these men. And society, by and large, supports him on this. But going back to Karla Homolka, it is the assumption of female hypoagency and innocence that allowed Karla to go free. It is the assumption that men and women are different and that we should make leeway for that in our legal decisions that allowed a fundamental investigative breakdown in the investigation of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, one that assumed that Homolka must have been manipulated into this by her murderous boyfriend. It's the same exact mentality that McInnes is displaying here that led to detectives placing the majority of the guilt on the man before it was proven in a court of law because he was the man, and then offering a plea bargain to Homolka in exchange for her testimony, leading to Homolka only serving 12 years, and tapes surfacing after this deal had been struck that showed Homolka was an active participant the whole time.